I just started it. So we're 12:30. We'll just give people a minute to get into the room. Do you want to say that, Jeff?
Hello, everyone. Bonjour, mesdames et messieurs. We're going to give everybody another 30 seconds to join the webinar. We know that we have pretty close to 100 participants signed up, and we'd like to make sure that as many of you as possible have managed to get to your computers for this very interesting presentation. So I'm looking at my director here and waiting for the go signal. If we're live now, I think we should probably get underway.
Sure. Why don't we get started then?
So I'll start again. Hello, everyone. Bonjour, mesdames et messieurs. My name's Jeff Longadoc, and I'm the Executive Director of the Canadian Aeronautics and Space Institute. I'm delighted to be your host for this inaugural CASI Web Talk. Our speaker today is Dr. John Maris. With me here at CASI headquarters in Ottawa are April Duffy and Danielle Tremblay. John is joining us from Montreal. During the presentation, we welcome your participation. Click on the question tab that you'll see on your screen and type your question. We will get to as many as time permits following John's presentation. Dr. John Maris is president of Marinvent Corporation, the multiple award-winning company that he founded in 1983. He is past chair of the Aerospace Industries Association of Canada and current chair of its Small Business Committee. He has a test pilot specialization in human factors and, just a few weeks ago, completed his doctorate in human factors at Embry-Riddle Aeronautical University. John is a fellow of CASI and in 2005 was the recipient of the Trans-Canada Trophy, Canada's oldest and most prestigious aeronautical award. To give you a full list of John's accomplishments and accolades would take much more time than we have today, and I'm sure you're eager to hear his presentation. So, without further ado, I'm delighted to introduce today's CASI Web Talk speaker, Dr. John Maris. John, over to you. And please give us just a few seconds to hand off to John.
Merci, Jeff, and thank you for that very flattering introduction. I'm going to continue in English, mais si vous voulez, vous pouvez poser des questions en français. So, in this first of the CASI series, I'm going to talk a little bit about human factors with a humorous outlook. And it's based on my experience and some research I've done, both as a test pilot and as a human factors historian, if you will. I'm going to give you a brief overview of the analog display evolution, how cockpits have evolved, go into synthetic and enhanced vision systems, combined vision, and then I'll summarize a quick timeline of how radio navigation has evolved. We'll start at the beginning with this humble fuel gauge. I don't think it's difficult to understand how it works, a cork floating in the fuel tank with a wire sticking out of the top right in front of the pilot. It has several benefits. It's direct reading. It works in case of electrical failure, although this aircraft didn't have an electrical system. And if some malfunction takes place and the float sinks or falls off, it's fail-safe. You think you have no fuel, which makes you land quicker rather than later. And there are some folks that landed at Gimli and the Azores that would have liked a direct reading fuel gauge, such as this one. Moving to early airspeed indicators, they came in two flavors, and there's one you could mount on the left-hand wing strut and one you could mount on the right-hand wing strut. And the operating mechanism is rather easy to see how it works, and to pre-flight, the only disadvantage is you had to look sideways out of the window at the most critical times during takeoff and landing to figure out how fast you were going. As you can see, the cockpit gradually became more and more complex. On the left is a fairly well-equipped Piper Cub, and on the right is an early model DC-3. Actually, they're not much different. And it astonishes me that anyone could navigate using the cockpit they had in the DC-3 on a scheduled commercial air service in all weathers. They did a miraculous job with the equipment that they had. As the pace of sophistication avionics accelerated, we added more and more aircrew. I love this picture, and I'll have you look over it and try and count the hats to see how many people it took to operate this Stratocruiser at about 250 knots and 15 to 20 odd thousand feet. There are 5 folks on board to keep this airplane running. And the pace kept accelerating. So as a little quiz, which 2 aircraft am I showing you here? There are some very distinctive clues for the one on the left, and the one on the right is fairly well known. You can start by counting the throttles. So on the left we have Concorde. The giveaways are the visor is up. As an aside, they used to park it with the visor up because it looked better that way, even though the normal position for it to taxi would be with the visor down. So you can see that the Concorde has 2 windshields and the outer one is raised right now. Also, if you look at the control yokes on the Concorde, they're what's called a ram's horn, which is used by Embraer and British designs. And the idea was to keep the center of the control wheel out of the primary field of view of the pilots. And you can see that V in the middle of the control column gives a better view of the artificial horizon right in front of it. And the third clue that it's Concorde is that I've got a big Concorde book behind me that you might be able to see. On the right, we have a 747 Classic. I think you can see that the human factor situation is getting almost untenable in these aircraft, and it would keep 3 people full-time busy to operate these aircraft under normal conditions, and even more so when things went wrong. We'll have a look at some individual gauges as they evolved. The humble airspeed indicator. I was born and raised in England, so I can make fun of British design. I do like the 2 on the right there, where the units are apparently random, and the needles go twice around the scale to figure out how fast you're going. If you take the middle gauge there, it's calibrated in knots or tens of knots, and you can see 26 is adjacent to 10 and 12. So you needed to be a bit of a psychic to figure out how fast you were actually going. And this also introduced the possibility of misreading the dial by looking at the wrong scale, inner or outer, and misreading by over 100 knots in some cases. Now you might argue you know whether you're within 100 knots of your target speed. It turns out it wasn't always the case. Altimeters had their own problems. On the left we have the classic 3-pointer altimeter, and on the right we have what's called the counter-pointer altimeter. So I'll open up for 2 Trivial Pursuit questions on the left-hand display. What is the slashed, cross-hatched little patch at the bottom at 6 o'clock on the altimeter? As a clue, it's not a power failure indication. These instruments weren't powered, although they used to suffer from stiction because they were very sophisticated clockwork. So early 3-pointer instruments used in jet aircraft had vibrators built into them to shake the instrument to keep it from sticking. And in fact, if the vibrator failed, the instrument was basically US. Also, there's a little triangle at 12 o'clock, just next to the 0. Anyone know what those are for? Well, I'll give you the answer. You read this instrument using the small pointer for thousands of feet, the long thin pointer for hundreds of feet, and the almost invisible short narrow pointer for tens of thousands of feet. And as you can see, if you didn't have the arrow and the extension up at 12 o'clock, that little pointer could be hidden behind one of the other pointers, leading to a misread of 10,000 feet or more with this instrument. And there were some accidents caused by them being misread, particularly at high rates of change that were associated with jet aircraft operations. So the cross-hatching underneath is a you're below 10,000 foot indicator. And the idea here was that the cross-hatching would appear if you're below 10,000 feet. Anywhere above that, if you misread the altimeter by 10,000 feet, well, that's not so important because you probably won't hit anything. The 3-pointer altimeter was banned for transport jet operations quite a while ago following some high-profile accidents, leading to the counter-pointer design, which was the epitome of the analog indication of altitude. Now, again, being British, I can make fun of the design. Here is the Bristol Fater design, which I adore. In human factors, there's a very famous doctor of human factors named James Reason that came up with the Swiss cheese theory of accidents, which is basically that each safeguard you have to prevent an accident is represented by a slice of Swiss cheese, and each hole represented a gap in that safeguard. And when all of the slices of Swiss cheese lined up, so the holes lined up, something escaped the net and you had an accident. Well, this cockpit is a predecessor to James Reason's Swiss cheese model. It's the Swiss cheese design model where you take a lump of Swiss cheese and put instruments in each of the holes. And if there's any room left over, that's where you insert the pilot. Notice that the British folks did try and apply some human factors principles. Notice the color coding on various systems like the throttles and propeller controls and mixture controls and the trimmers, and also their shape coding, the T-handles on the throttles and the propellers with the sort of cylindrical displays and the mixture controls in spherical form. I can just imagine following an engine failure, the captain saying, feather the right engine, and the co-pilot going, which one is that? And he goes, the green ones, or the cylinders. Anyway, this was the state of our human factors about 40 years ago. Finally, electronic flight instrument systems, EFIS, arrived. And what did we do as the creative, imaginative, high-tech industry that aerospace is? The first thing we did was take a picture of the old instruments and display the exact same symbology on the new instrument. So if you look at the artificial horizon of a 737 with the early glass cockpit, you can see it looks pretty much identical to its predecessor, the 727. I particularly like the engine instruments. If you look at the right-hand picture, you can see there's a long, tall LCD or LED display. I'm not sure what they had. I think it was LCD. And you can see two rows of circular dials that mimic exactly the circular dials that were in the older aircraft. And in fact, this presentation did lead directly to an accident in East Midlands because aircrew associated the wrong secondary indications with the primary indications and shut down an engine that was working well when the other engine was on fire. The pace quickened and we eventually saw the light. This is a Gulfstream plane view cockpit, and you can see two tendencies. One is fewer and larger screens, and the other is the appearance of a head-up display. In this case, a single head-up display. You can see it on the captain's side, on the left side, just in the middle of the windshield. Head-up displays obviously were commonplace in the military, but civilian applications took a while before they appeared. The Airbus 380 had a similar cockpit, fewer large screens. And notice this aircraft has a side stick. And so in front of the pilot, you could put a desk with a keyboard or footrests, depending on how busy you felt. On the left, you can see it's in the footrest position. And on the right, the co-pilot's obviously going to have to work here and is looking at his desk or her desk. Closer to home, this is the C-Series prototype. Look what a clean cockpit this is for a two-crew operation. Once again, we have the side sticks. We have the large screens. We have two head-up displays in this case, left and right. And if you look closely, just adjacent to the throttles, you'll see something that's just beginning to appear, which is cursor control devices or trackballs. The screens now are becoming more and more interactive, and so the crew need an input device. Some manufacturers went with touch screens, but most went with the trackball approach. Moving further ahead, the Global 7000. Screens are bigger yet, fewer of them, and the very prominent trackpad devices on the center pedestal. You can see another little device that's making an appearance called the electronic flight bag. That's the small screen with the airport map to the left. And those are now basically replacing paper volumes of charts. And I'm fairly proud that my company was heavily involved in the early development of electronic flight bags when they were viewed as sort of quirky alternates to the real thing, which was paper. Now there are about 150,000 folks using EFBs in airline use worldwide. The next generation relates to synthetic and enhanced vision systems, but before we could move on to these, an important thing had to take place, which was in 2000, President Clinton signed an order which eliminated military selective availability on GPS signals. The military used to basically fuzz the GPS signals to make them less accurate on the principle that you didn't want bad guys to be using your GPS to put weapons on your territory. But everyone figured out that eventually they could do this with their own GPS signals, and so President Clinton opened up GPS to all of us. And this is what allowed the evolution of synthetic vision and enhanced vision systems, and to some degree, electronic flight bags. We'll start with synthetic vision systems, SVS. The FAA defines these as electronic means to display synthetic images, basically, of the external scene. They can be head up or head down, and they can include terrain, obstacle, airports, and other data from the database. The early TCAS and ground proximity warning systems had elements of synthetic vision. A very important thing to understand with SVS is that these displays do not show the real world. They make believe what the real world should look like, and they're as only as accurate as the navigation solution of the aircraft and the database that draws the data that you're looking at. They're flying flight simulation views, effectively. The good news is they're always crystal clear and very easy to read. This example shows one of the raison d'etre for synthetic vision systems. If you saw the news recently, a rather famous Hollywood star just landed on a taxiway, and I had made the slide up quite a long time before that event took place. But it's the sort of mistake that synthetic vision systems would help eliminate, because it would be pretty clear what the runway is and what the taxiway is. Here's an example of a synthetic vision system made by Garmin. You won't clear the red terrain. You're rather too close to the yellow terrain, and the brown, green, and blue terrain you will clear. This is the Collins equivalent, and there's a dome in the middle which represents maybe restricted airspace, an airport traffic area, or in a military context, this could be a SAM envelope which you would try and avoid. Honeywell's equivalent, once again, very similar, and you can see almost a photorealistic rendition of the terrain. Universal makes another system. This is the EFI 890R. And one of the interesting aspects of the EFI 890 is that it has what's called an exocentric view, which is you can see yourself flying by the terrain, which is shown on the right-hand screen. The verdict's out as to how useful that is, but it's certainly eye-catching and a unique application of synthetic vision. Moving now to some trials that I did for NASA. This was a highway in the sky synthetic vision departure, where we flew that yellow channel to try and avoid terrain when normal nav aids wouldn't make us fly this escape maneuver. It was for a 757 losing an engine in a critical situation. Moving on now to enhanced vision systems. Basically, enhanced vision takes a sensor and somehow makes its output visible to the pilots. It could be radar, it could be forward-looking infrared, it could be image intensifiers, and it could be presented head up or head down. The early FLIR systems in the military were the basis of enhanced vision. Well, there have been several examples why EVS is useful. There was a very sad accident in Taipei airport where I think Singapore Airlines 747 took off on the wrong runway and hit construction equipment, killing a whole bunch of people on board. And in Italy, an MD-87 crashed onto a Cessna on the runway, killing an awful lot of folks. So one of the applications of enhanced vision is you can see better at night, and you can see through certain conditions that you can't see through with your normal eyes. Enhanced vision tends not to do very well with very wet and foggy conditions, but otherwise, this is the kind of contrast, for example, with the CMC SureSight system. You can see a day and a night view with the enhanced and non-enhanced outputs. A couple of technical tidbits with EVS. The training required, thermal crossover, thermal imprinting, and eye camera reference misaligns. So I'll just deal with a few of these. Thermal crossover, if you can imagine a concrete or asphalt runway, gets very hot in the daytime and cools off rapidly at night, whereas the adjacent grass tends to keep a more even temperature. That means twice a day they are the same thermal temperature, and the runway disappears into the equivalent of a whiteout or blackout, and you can't see it at all. It's a predictable enough phenomenon that it can be forecast, but it can catch you unawares if you're not ready for it. Thermal imprinting is where the jumbo jet in front of you is held on the runway waiting for a departure clearance, and he cooks the ground underneath him and then takes off. And as you come in on final, you see a lovely vivid image of a 747 on the threshold, even though the aircraft is long departed. It can be a little disorienting if you're not expecting it. Eye versus camera reference, well, the cameras aren't mounted where you're looking, and that's okay unless you're at very low altitude or trying to taxi with these things. You have to bear in mind that what the camera sees is not what you're seeing. Those of you with cameras in your cars can appreciate what that can cause if you confuse its reference position with yours. And the final point is that the displays are compelling. Both synthetic and enhanced vision displays are computerized. They are pixels that you are seeing, not photons, or not photons from the outside world. So even though enhanced vision is a representation of the real world out there, don't confuse it with a telescope or something that optically magnifies. These are electronic displays that can make mistakes, that can be misaligned, that can drop pixels. So the certification of these things takes some thought. So a couple of milestones. Basically, we weren't doing anything with EVS until 2001, and the most recent development is possibly this week, where the FAA is going to allow enhanced vision-only landing systems. So you can land basically blind to the normal eye, but with the enhanced vision. One aspect that you may not consider is that in order to allow enhanced vision, the FAA had to change the definition of what vision meant, because the early definition said that it was the view that the pilot had from his reference position. And of course, it's not a pilot that's seeing anything with an enhanced vision system. It's the vision system that the pilot observes. And so they changed the definition of what vision meant. The latest developments are combined vision systems. This is the Dassault Falcon implementation, where you superimpose both synthetic and enhanced vision and try and get the best of both worlds. And so the runway is outlined in the synthetic vision, a lot of synthetic vision symbology, and the enhanced vision is the topography that you can see. I'm going to summarize with a quick timeline of radio navigation, because we started with a cork-mounted fuel gauge and ended up with combined synthetic and enhanced vision systems. In 1928, the only radio navigation we had was 4 courses. You could go in one particular direction or one of 4 directions to a beacon. In 1944, we had the very high frequency omnidirectional radio range, which touted the fact that it was proudly able to get you going in any direction as long as it was directly to or from a beacon. The US Navy introduced Loran C, which was our first area navigation system in 1957. And in 1961, for the first time, we could find out directly how far we were from the beacon with the advent of distance measuring equipment. Inertial nav came from military to civilian aircraft in the mid-60s. The first satellite nav and area navigation, random navigation as it used to be called, showed up in the late 60s. And look at this. In 1973, we put out our last airway light beacon, where either a light or a bomb fire showed us the way to go. 1973. The first civilian GPSs made their debut in the early 80s. Omega came and went in 83 and was then subsequently discontinued. As I mentioned before, selective availability went away in 2000. And in 2003, we had wide area augmentation system, which opened the way to precision approaches to airfields with no radio aids. We now have operational credit for enhanced vision systems down to landing, and synthetic vision systems are now beginning to get deployed with operational credit being sought for them. To conclude this rather rapid review of human factors in a century, we've come a long way. You've seen some trends like display integration, increasing automation, simplification, and clearly a reduction in crew sizes. Extrapolating this, standby for single and zero pilot passenger aircraft operations. And if you think I'm out to lunch here, I've been personally involved with NASA programs that have exactly that objective. And the driver for that, you won't believe, is cost. It's to get the pilot out of the seat just for cost purposes. And attendant with that is distributed command and control between the aircraft, the ground station, and the automation. And we're seeing increasing use of that with NextGen, the FAA's NextGen program. So that brings us to time. I'd love to throw it open now for any questions. And Jeff, if you have anything, I'd be happy to take questions now.
Okay, thanks a lot, John. That was, as you say, rapid and extremely informative. There's a lot of material in there. It seems like you've actually struck dumb the audience, at least for the moment. So I have a couple of questions that I'd like to put out there that maybe will be of interest to some of our audience members today. The first one is, what does it take to become expert in the area of human factors? You've done a PhD, John. That's about as far as you can go academically. But I wonder, at the bachelor's and master's level, what recommendations you'd make to young engineers who would like to get more involved in the human factors area?
It's a good question, Jeff. Human factors is one of these topics that actually is relatively nascent. It hasn't been around all that long. It used to be that systems were designed and then the human factors were looked at after the fact, and usually it's too late at that point. So there are a number of very good undergraduate human factors, both in North America and abroad. The center of human factors is probably the sort of Dayton, Ohio area where the Air Force has its main human factors laboratories. So the first thing is academics. In any test pilot course, there's an element of systems. It's about a third of the training, and human factors are basically an integral part of that. Interestingly, there were no regulations until very recently related to human factors for certification. They were wrapped up in the sort of bigger picture of how bright are the lights, how visible is the display, what angle of viewing do you have. But they weren't called human factors regs. They would be sort of peripheral to human factors. Now we actually do have some hardcore human factors regulations. I think the best thing that someone can do is just show an interest and either study it formally. It can be an aspect of industrial engineering, human factors, or a dedicated course in ergonomics. There are short courses available, and I've taught human factors at university for a number of years, and I'd be happy to refer people if they want to ask where they might be able to go. But it's a fascinating field, and the more adventurous we go in aviation, the harder we push aircraft and spacecraft, the more important the human aspect becomes.
Right. Well, thanks for that. Chad English has submitted a question. Hi, Chad. Nice to have you aboard. Chad's question is, do the automated / zero pilot passenger aircraft fall under the same regulations as UAV / RPAS / BVLOS, or are they unique?
That's a fabulous question that would need another hour to try and answer, because I've written very detailed material on that very topic. My answer is simply, it's an overlap of, let's take UAS and beyond visual line of sight. So there's a certain aspect there. We have a trend where we've seen the cockpit go from 5 crew to 2 crew, and with the ability to fly if one of those crew becomes incapacitated. So we've essentially taken an aircraft like a 777 of that size and sophistication that can, at a pinch, be flown by 1 pilot. So what are the trends that brought us from 5 to 1 pilot, and how do they continue and extrapolate? Then, as we said, there's the UAS. How do we fly an aircraft with no pilots? And then the third element I would add is operational considerations. So, for example, we have to think outside the box. Before we could fly across the ocean with only 2 engines, we had to do ETOPS, which was build our confidence that we could fly with 1 remaining engine after an engine failure and land somewhere safe. Well, why don't we apply the same thing with a 1 or 0 pilot aircraft? We don't have to be able to fly where we were going before. So, for example, if we lost the 1 remaining pilot and had a UAS capability, what if we could land it on the dry lake bed at Edwards, where the runways are 5 miles long and we're not near too many folks? So I think the answer lies in a combination of unmanned vehicle, extrapolating the reduced crew trends, and a complete rethink of operations. Why don't we make the flight attendants able to press the right buttons to do a one-off emergency landing, for example, a get-you-home aspect. So some combination of these things will be required. I don't think any one single solution is going to give us 0 pilot operations.
Another question. Is it not the case that some cargo aircraft actually are pilotless at the moment? Or are they at least pilotless ready?
I can't answer that explicitly. I know you read that Amazon and folks like that are trying to do deliveries. I wouldn't call them in the realm of cargo aircraft. I'm not aware of any pilotless cargo aircraft operations from the FedExes and UPSs of the world. But explicitly, the first unmanned aircraft, commercial aircraft, I think will be cargo aircraft, because at the very least, you're not going to do harm to passengers if something goes wrong with a robot flying the airplane. So I don't think it exists today. I may be wrong. I stand corrected if I am. But I think that, yes, the FedExes and the UPSs that tend to be industry leaders anyway would be probably the first targets for unmanned or single pilot operations.
Right, and I guess we have time for maybe one more question, maybe 2. This from Don Van Dyke. Don, knowing of your work in the field, much is made of side sticks, with and without haptic feedback. Your opinion on the merits of each, please, particularly given modern concepts of CRM and MPL training.
Oh, Don, you had to ask that one. That's going to take me a long time. So for those that aren't aware, haptic feedback is when the stick talks back to you. You push it and it pushes back against you, or it vibrates against you, or in some way lets you know what the stick is thinking. I have personal opinions. I have nothing against side sticks. I've flown a lot of aircraft with side sticks, like the F-16 has them, and I've flown some research aircraft with side sticks. And they are very effective. They get this enormous yoke out from in front of the instrument panel where it obscures everything. And remember the reason we had a control column in the first place. It's for aircraft that had massively high control forces. Well, now, the traditional airliner has no ability for manual reversion if all the hydraulics fail, so you don't need this enormous lever arm where both pilots can put their feet on the panel and pull like crazy to move the airplane around. Having said all of that, I am a believer in haptic feedback, not only from the aircraft, but from what the other pilot is doing. Because if Don and I are flying together and he's moving his stick left and I'm moving my stick right, at the very least, I'd like to know he's doing that. And with old coupled controls, whatever he did at the wheel, I would feel directly. And I could say, hey, Don, what are you doing? Or help me move the stick this way. But with the side sticks, without haptic feedback, you have to use intelligent methods to let the other pilot know what's going on. And there are methods. There are lights and there are captions that can come up. I'm a believer in some way linking the two pilots, not mechanically necessarily, but haptically. Other manufacturers have taken a different approach, and it seems to be working for them. But in the realm of personal opinion, I would like to see haptics and a link between the pilots.
Well, I think we're just about out of time. My producer here is, yes, can we run the final slide of yours, John, and then we'll take it back and conclude things for you.
So, yes, Jeff. First of all, I'd like to thank everyone that took the time over lunch to listen to my little rambling discussion on human factors. I appreciate the time you took, and I hope you enjoyed it. I just want to say I will be at CASI Aero 2017 in Toronto at the Sheraton, Airport Sheraton. And if you want to nail me with some of these much more in-depth questions and have a discussion over a drink, I'd be delighted to share that with you. So now I'll hand it back to our host, Jeff. Thank you very much for the invitation to present today, and I hope everyone got something out of it.
John, I don't think there's any doubt about that. Thank you so much for being our introductory CASI Web Talk speaker. It's a great honor to have someone with your distinguished career in aviation, and especially in the area of human factors, to join us today, and to understand a little bit better, thanks to your presentation, how the study of human factors has influenced the evolution of aviation cockpits and instrumentation. And thanks to everyone in the audience who shared with us this first CASI Web Talk. As he mentioned, John will be a panelist at the upcoming CASI Aero 2017 conference being held at the Toronto Airport Sheraton Hotel from the 16th to the 18th of May. Online registration and hotel booking for the conference can be done on the CASI website. And there will be a Human Factors Symposium as part of the technical program of Aero 2017. We will ask you for your feedback in a very short poll that will be sent out shortly, and we'd welcome your thoughts about how we can do things differently and enable you to get more out of these half-hour presentations. The next CASI Web Talk is scheduled for mid-March, and we will be sure to provide you with details as they become available. I hope you'll join us again next month. Goodbye for now, et au revoir.
Well done. So now how do we get out?